is some story, isn't it? The rise of the Warriors, and they did it in style against the Knights. Gal, the big concern, I guess, for the Warriors is to make sure that they can maintain the rage, not have played their grand final perhaps like the Knights did the previous.
Yeah, away from home also, which they've obviously got to do next week. Look, they started that game fantastically. I mean, the Knights looked shell-shocked. They got the ball first, and from their first 2 or 3 tackles, just looked out of sorts, dropped the ball early, and then it was just all the Warriors. The Newcastle Knights did not complete a set of 6 in the first 15 minutes of the match. The Warriors just ran all over them. They led 16-0. But I've got to say that they did shake a little. For the last probably 20 minutes of that first half, I thought the Newcastle Knights were well and truly on top. They just couldn't convert it to points. They scored 1 try, but they had the field position. Whenever the 5th tackle came, they'd put up a kick, and they just did not compete enough for me. They could put a whole lot more pressure on the Warriors' wingers and centres, but they never. But then the second half started and they got the early try in the first 2 or 3 minutes of the game. So the game on here, 16-10, it's on here. And Warriors in the past, without that, would have shaken, would have failed, I think. But this team's a different team. They're a different team. They complete well. And, they got their wits about them. And the last probably 30 minutes of that match were all over the Newcastle Knights. Scored 4 tries in the last 30 minutes and played pretty well at the end of it. 40 points to 10 is a good score.
Gus, Gal says they're a different team this year. Why? What's so different about them?
Well, a lot of credit's got to go to the coach. They've got tremendous mental strength. They've got a defensive pattern that has stood the test of the whole season. It stood up under pressure. I said in the last couple of weeks, their last round of the Premiership, they rested a lot of players playing against Redcliffe, knowing full well they had the finals, and then they lost their halfback leading into the first semi-final against Penrith at Penrith. And even though they went there and competed, I think in the back of their minds, they knew that was probably a bridge too far and had their minds on this first home semi here. And you could see that. I think it's been a very mature approach. Had the Penrith game been a grand final, I wonder if Shaun Johnson would have played, or whether or not there was really that much wrong with him that he was rested for that Penrith game, because he was certainly 100% on the weekend and he played extraordinarily well. And the 2 players that I've really highlighted this year has been Tohu Harris and Adam Fanua-Blake, who set a wonderful platform in the middle of the field. Those 2 big fellows. You don't win these types of games without dominating up front, and they led the way for their forward pack, and they were just too much for the Newcastle Knights. There's a famous line out of The Wizard of Oz where she says, "We're not in Kansas anymore." I said it during the commentary on the weekend. It was very obvious early that the Knights were not in Newcastle anymore.
But you could tell from the opening tackle, like they almost ran out off the kickoff, almost got taken out. Tackle 2, pass never went to the right man. Tackle 3, the same. Tackle 4, they dropped it. They were in all sorts from the start of the match.
Gus,
they did come back, but weren't good enough.
Can I ask you about the Shaun Johnson? How he got there? I know that you were around the club at that time, and was it something that you helped organise? I mean, I believe there was a game of golf involved, and somehow he ended up back there because he wasn't welcome for a long time at that club. In fact, a lot of people at the Warriors no longer like Shaun Johnson, but he found his way back there.
Yeah, I don't really want to talk about that. It was a couple of years ago, and Shaun had an unhappy hot time at the Sharks and was looking to get back to the Warriors, and he'd obviously left the Warriors some years earlier. But it didn't take long for a conversation to understand that he would love to go back to New Zealand, love to go back to the club, and the owner, Mark Robinson, was only too happy to take him, and it's been a wonderful partnership. He didn't get what he wanted straight away because they had to stay in Redcliffe for another 12 months during the COVID year, but now that he's got back to New Zealand and full-time, it's been really good for him.
I'll look at the player we see now and the player that played at Cronulla. And even the player that played last year. Last year when the Warriors were playing, I thought Shaun Johnson should retire. I really did, because he was nowhere near what he was. And at Cronulla, look, he wasn't great at Cronulla. And for me, he wasn't happy. He just wasn't happy in life outside of rugby league. Ever since he's gone back home, he's with his family, he's happy, he's with his friends. And he's been a totally different player this year than he has been the last 3 or 4 years. Totally different.
Did you see the scenes where he walked from the field? They took him off with a few minutes to go, and he walked along the dead ball line and along the ground. I mean, it was just... And I said at the top of this show, it was amazing for our code. It was a wonderful time for Shaun Johnson there on the weekend. And like Newcastle the week before, where they had this sort of day in front of their home crowd, it was always going to be difficult to come down off that and go across the road to a completely opposite environment like they got this week. Now, the Warriors are the same. The Warriors have experienced something that you'll go through your whole life and never experience again, that sort of afternoon that they had. They've got to leave that behind, jump on a plane and go to Brisbane, into the exact opposite atmosphere they're going to get at Suncorp Stadium next Saturday night. So it's a big challenge for them, but they wouldn't swap that day for the world. I'm glad that Shaun Johnson was there for it. I'm glad that they won so convincingly, and it was just not just great for the Warriors, who'd been through a lot, it was great for our code. It was so important because it's a great time in New Zealand at the moment for rugby league to get their foothold and set up the proper pathways and help that club be a juggernaut and help New Zealand international football be the rival that we want.